Wray. Welcome. Thank you. I want to start by thanking you and the 38,000 men and women of the FBI for their service and devotion to our country, the Constitution, the rule of law. I want to thank you for the FBI's efforts that have made a concrete difference in my hometown and my state in recent weeks. In just the last few months, actually, the FBI has worked with law enforcement and prosecutors in Delaware to secure convictions in murder for hire, stalking, kidnapping, firearms, and child pornography cases. I've paid close attention in my 22 years in elected office at the county level and here in the Senate on state, federal, and local partnerships in law enforcement, and the FBI is making a difference in reducing violent crime in Wilmington and in Delaware. President Biden, in his State of the Union 6 months ago, said clearly, we shouldn't have to choose between safety and equal justice. We should come together to protect our communities, restore trust, and that the answer is not to defund the police, but to fund the police with resources and training needed to properly protect our communities. The American Rescue Plan made $350 billion available for states, cities, counties to hire more police and invest in proven strategies like community violence interruption. And just recently, the Safer America Plan was announced by the administration, which would invest $13 billion in hiring and training 100,000 additional police officers for accountable community policing, and it would make significant investments in community violence prevention. We've seen the value of this in Wilmington recently as there's been a sharp decline in gun homicides and overall shootings, and law enforcement leaders in my community have attributed those declines to a multifaceted approach that brings together a focus on gun crime enforcement, investments in violence interruption programs, and community policing. Could you briefly speak, Director, to the value of an approach that combines investment in law enforcement and community programs and violence interruption efforts?
So I think the point that you're getting at is spot on, because one of the things that we find in dealing with any threat, but especially something like the violent crime threat, is that we can't investigate our way out of it all by itself. That is an incredibly important, in many ways, that's job one, but we have to find a way to prevent it from happening in the first place. And so community outreach is an important secondary component to that, to do everything from get people who see something to say something and communicate with law enforcement, to develop sources in that regard, but also to educate, in particular, juveniles about what they may face if they, pursue a path of violence. When I talk to chiefs and sheriffs around the country, and certainly to our agents, the phenomenon of juveniles engaging in violence I'm hearing about everywhere. And the laws as they currently stand are of limited effectiveness, frankly, against juvenile violence. But those juveniles then go on to graduate to more and more serious violence. And so if we can figure out a way to try to start addressing the problem when they're juveniles as well, I think that's got to be an important piece. No substitute, I should say, for aggressive, strong law enforcement, but as an additional component to the overall strategy.
Well, thank you. One of the laws I'd like to now talk about is how you're proceeding with implementing the Nix Denial Notification Act. You referenced earlier, it's striking how many felons walk into gun stores and try to buy guns, even though they know they're a person prohibited. Something like 10 to 20%, according to an ATF study, of individuals who tried to buy a gun and were denied by a background check went on to commit a subsequent firearm crime in the following few years. Senator Cornyn and I led the passage of the Nix Denial Notification Act, which says that local law enforcement needs to be alerted when someone who's a person prohibited lies and tries. I'd be interested in what the FBI is doing to enact this legislation and the provision in the bipartisan Safer Communities Act that requires enhanced background checks for people under 21 to buy long guns.
So on the Nix denial notification legislation, and I'm obviously aware that this is an issue that you've led for a long time. We are in the process there. We're going to need significant system upgrades to fully implement that, so we're in the midst of that right now because that significantly expands the interconnectivity that we'll need to have So that there's a heavy IT systems upgrade dimension to fully implementing that. On the more recent legislation that you mentioned, there will be a number of new fronts where I anticipate us interacting both with state and local colleagues on the juvenile issue, in particular with FFLs over the stolen gun potential offer for resale issue, and then also on the option for FFLs to use the system for employees that they're onboarding. So they're going to be, I think, significant demands on both our personnel and in particular on as well on our systems as we go forward under both pieces of legislation.
Thank you, Director. I have one more question for you, but I do want to say Senator Whitehouse asked a whole series of questions. I have joined him in a series of letters. This is simply trying to get to the bottom of the representations that were made to me and to us by then White House counsel about the supplemental background investigation being done by the book and trying to identify with clarity what happened in terms of the tip line and its management. And I think we should get answers to our questions and we should resolve this issue. So I look forward to working with you and hearing from you in the month ahead to finally bring this to a close.
I thank you, Senator, and we will work with you on that. I do want to be clear. I think I managed to get this across to Senator Whitehouse in the colloquy, but I have been assured back then and repeatedly ever since that the process that we followed, the practice that we followed for the limited supplemental background investigation in this instance was consistent with the same process that we followed going back to earlier in the Trump administration, the Obama administration, the Bush administration, and that we continue to follow now under the Biden administration.
My last question to you is one of the key failures of the Nassar investigation was the improper way FBI agents interviewed and interacted with victims of child sex abuse. This is something I've long worked on, both in my county elected role and here. Using forensic interviewers and other trained medical personnel is critical to protecting victims and ensuring the integrity of investigations. A tremendous resource is children's advocacy centers that provide exactly this sort of coordination. I'm working with Senators Klobuchar and Cornyn on a bipartisan bill that would require the FBI to bring together multidisciplinary teams of trained professionals in child abuse investigations. Could you just briefly speak to the value of partnering with the existing child advocacy centers and whether or not you would support legislation that would codify this requirement so that this implementation of an OIG recommendation would extend permanently?
Well, as to legislation, I would have to review it. I'm not in a position to comment on specific legislative ideas, but I will say that I share your view that this is a very specific skill set and requires a very specific touch and sensitivity. That's why the child adolescent forensic interviewers that we have are so important and is such an important mechanism consistent with the recommendations we got from the Inspector General. And so I think the point you're getting at is very consistent with that.
Thank you, Director. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Coons. And for the record, I'm going to ask consent to enter into the record a copy of the page that was